All right, hi everyone. So this is our forum two. The first question is that Sherlock argues that legislators are rewarded for their positions, not for the policy outcomes that result from their posit. I would agree with that. I think a lot of the discourse that happens around policy is centered around the popular position or a popular notion rather than a lot of times the work and the measures of and outcomes of that actual policy and what actually is working and what actually is not. And I think that's what the article is pretty much arguing, is that in the traditional sense of policy making or policy analysts, it's not really profitable because it's not really used when it comes down to enacting policy. And though I felt like the article was quite difficult to understand, I'm not sure if it's just my unfamiliarity with the language. I did feel like it was challenging to really digest and ingest, but I think that the overall theme was this idea of this traditional model of policy analysis, which tends to not be as valuable when creating policies. Um, and so she argues for a new way or a new possibility to that. Um, the second question is the TED Talk. So I'll be honest, I thought that the TED Talk was good, but I didn't necessarily see like a really clear like line and distinct thought to policy. It was like motivational, it was inspirational, it was aspirational. It seemed like something that companies would really want to bring in terms of a culture of change. But when thinking about policy, the amoeba model made sense in the sense of like the adaptations and such that need to take place, um, building and the different kinds of people that the organization needs. But it wasn't necessarily something revolutionary. I think that when creating policy, it is important to get a bunch of innovators, and it is important to get a bunch of change agents and have communicators. And it also is important to be mindful of, you know, the recluses and the reactionaries and the curmudgeons. And I think managing that space and knowing how and when to use people. And I also think like that the amoeba bottle is clever and creative to an extent in how on the fringes is where you see uh, the change begin, and then it sort of like morphs into this total change for everyone. But it doesn't start out as this, you know, central change. It starts on the fringes, which I think is something that we do see. I think we see innovation in areas that initially may be considered taboo or touchy, or they don't make as much sense. Um, and I think one of those for me, and I don't know how much this applies to family policy, but when I think of that amoeba model, I think of policy related to climate change. I think when climate change first came about, many people thought it was hocus pocus. You know, what is this ozone layer? What all does plastic have to do with that? What all does paper consumption have to do with that? And it was pretty widely rejected as sort of odd and different. And now, for the most part, with the exception of certain fringe groups, it's sort of widely understood that we have to take care of this planet, and we haven't been doing a good job at that. And we're seeing that in the decrease in bees. We're seeing that in the increase in the list of endangered species. We're seeing that in the rise of outbreaks that have been nearly extinct for years. And so we're seeing it in so many ways. And I think so by and large, it's sort of co-opted into a really mainstream idea, but it originally started as like a fringe idea. These polar caps are melting. It was like this fringe idea, but now it's sort of widely accepted as we need to be responsible for the planet that we live on in the way that we consume. So I would say climate change and policy around that will be one of them. In terms of family policy, I'm not sure, and I'd love to see what other people think. I'm not sure what family policy sort of started as fringe movements and now have become mainstream. I think maybe policy related to the criminal justice system that definitely wasn't seen as something that needed much reform. It was sort of pounded on to the point where activists and educators really had to become involved in the conversation and sort of push the agenda forward for reform. And so perhaps you could see that as one. And now it's sort of, pop culture. It's sort of a hot button item for people to talk about criminal justice reform to the point where we have Kim Kardashian and these sort of like, pop icons sort of in the conversation now in that space. And so maybe criminal justice could be seen as one. And that's what comes to mind when I think about it. I think I identify most with the communicator, so the change agent. I think that for me, communication and language is really important. And I think the deeper I get into this work, the more that I really identify and align with language and narrative practice and how that really informs and, crafts how we see the world and how we see people, but also can be reframed and reframe how we see the world and how we see people. And so I think for me, I'd probably find myself there. But I think in some ways, too, I can be on the other side. I can find myself in a reactionary position because particularly if it's something that's of personal meaning, I can be one of those that is outspoken, that is passionate about a particular topic. So I think by and large, though, I find myself, I think, working best as a communicator. And then the second TED Talk, it was amazing. Jabari, he really gave a sort of classic example of internalized racism as well as sort of this enlightening, awakening moment and, really reckoning with his own racial identity and sort of morphing from where he was, sort of this complacency, this sort of like we are the same, this sort of egalitarianism to like a really amazing sense of racial pride, an amazing sense of, cultural heritage and background, and that there are distinct differences, and that that's not something to be afraid of or to shy away from, but really to embrace and to own, whether that be race, gender, or sexual orientation. And so I thought that was really, really dope. And then thinking about how those internalized systems of oppression might show up in the work that we do as change agents in the Amoeba model. I think that because language for me is associated with the Amoeba model, I think that's one of the best ways for me, narrative practice, to really demystify, deconstruct these ideas, even externalize these ideas of oppression, these ideas of labels associated with value and being as a result of the constructs of race in our society. And I think sort of deconstructing these ideas of power and dominance versus oppression and suppression. And I think even these ideas of internalized racism and what that is like and sort of externalizing it, but recognizing that when you grow up in certain environments, it's very easy to adopt and sort of co-opt the dominant discourse, even if it's about you, right? And I recognize and align very much with that experience because I grew up in a very similar situation, being an only Black person, a bunch of white people, a bunch of affluent white people, no less, but not necessarily fitting in either environment with other Black people or with white people, and knowing that I didn't really want to necessarily fit in with white people, and I didn't really want to necessarily fit in with those types of Black people either, and I didn't find my niche until college. And so I think that's where that awakening happened for me, and those messages of racial pride really came through, that weren't necessarily just attached to my ethnicity, being Caribbean American or first generation Caribbean, but also were attached to the African American struggle and this Afrocentrism and this idea of beauty and brilliance and brightness that comes from being Black, that comes from being a woman, frankly. And so I think the work that we do as change agents is to use language and narrative practice to combat, dismantle, deconstruct, externalize the ways in which these larger societal systems of oppression have made it challenging for individuals to show up in whatever way that is. So yeah, I will say, as just feedback and commentary on the article, I again found it kind of difficult to digest, um, and I'd love to know what you all thought about it too, and what is sort of what you took away from it. I did enjoy the TED Talks, but again, that first TED Talk I also was a bit perplexed by in a way. But yeah, this is longer than I thought. Anyways, see you guys. Bye.